everybody, and say thank you so much for coming. This is the panel discussion associated with our current exhibition, Undercurrent, by artist Stephanie Guerin, who's sitting here to my left. I did want to just thank our generous sponsors for this panel discussion and the exhibition, the Margaret E. Burnham Charitable Foundation, and the Maine Humanities Council. Thank you also to everyone who came out to see this panel this afternoon and to our lovely panelists. I hope for a fruitful discussion around the issues that the exhibit explores.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out, especially on such a beautiful day here in Maine. Thank you for coming to the University of Southern Maine. Our panel discussion is part of our fall exhibit, Undercurrent. My name is Stephanie Guerin, and I'm an environmental artist based out of Washington, D.C. I'd invite you to visit the show, which opened this Thursday at the USM Gorham campus, and it runs through December 7th. Today's panel is made possible with support from many different sources, from USM, from the Maine Humanities Council, and private contributors. I have a special personal thank you to Kat Zagaria Buckley, USM's art gallery director, my family, and G, who have traveled far to be here. I'm also honored, extremely honored, to have two people in this audience today who serve as daily role models to me for their visionary work. Severin von Scharner Fleming, welcome, the director behind Smithereen Farms and Greenhorns, who's forging an organic farming and sustainable community revolution based out of Pembroke, Maine. And Dr. Pamela Templer, Boston University's distinguished professor and chair of biology. 3 years ago, Smithereen Farms and Greenhorns asked me to work with them. They were the legal owners of over 20,000 mined rock ores from the 1800s, height of the gold rush. They were mining companies looking for silver. And a new mining company was coming to town, approaching to retap the land. Big Hill Mine sits on an aquifer, the water source for 5 towns and 2 Passamaquoddy reservations. Based on written journals and oral histories, the mine sits on land that was occupied by Passamaquoddy and sold without representation. Working with the mine rock samples perfectly aligned with my art practice, which investigates humanity's interruption of nature and brings nature into galleries as a platform for discussion for exactly this. I was eager for adventure. Was and willing, ready to learn. And I listened to everyone I could over the past 3 years, from geologists to local clamors, the Zipiac community, politicians, earth scientists, seamen, and town clerks. This exhibit is my visual voice. And although I'll be presenting an artist talk in a few weeks, and as this project has evolved, my intent has simply been to amplify the voices which harness the rock's historical, cultural, scientific, and spiritual significance to honor the material. The rocks are the single words of the Passamaquoddy language that Dwayne Thomas and Donald Sochtema are working tirelessly to preserve. The rocks are the single trees bulldozed for paper mills and drill holes. They are the night stars above your beautiful Maine lakes, forming a celestial map. They are your footsteps. I'm honored today to be joined by 5 individuals who have committed their lives to dissecting these environmental issues. Collectively, they bring a range of perspectives and experiences to our table. We'll hope to chat for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to questions. I'd like to introduce to you, unfortunately, our first guest, Charlie Loring, Chuck, is under the weather and wrote to me some responses or some answers to some of the questions we're going to be talking about today. But Chuck is a director at the Penobscot Nation Natural Resources Department. I'd like to introduce to you Jan Murrell, the Earthworks Tailing Campaign Manager, Nick Lund, who's on his way, is the Maine Audubon Advocacy and Outreach Coordinator. Nikki Skara, from representing today Community Water Justice, and Dr. Bruce Taylor, Public Health Physician. So today we're going to start and we're going to jump in. We're going to start with a question that just taps into your professional roles, your personal experiences. What have you seen as the impacts of mining and in recent efforts by mining companies to open new mines? How have the communities that you've served been affected? So I would love, for all these different questions, we're gonna try and make it a spontaneous conversation, but because this is such a critical question and based on the range of professional and personal experiences, if we could each kind of go through. Dan, would you like to start?
Sure. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and I'm really happy to be here with Bruce and Nikki and Nick when he gets here. So yeah, I'm Jan Morrill. I work for an organization called Earthworks. Earthworks is a organization based out of DC that has worked for 30 years to support communities on the front lines of extraction projects. So we work with people that live next to hard rock mining, next to oil fields, and next to natural gas infrastructure. And this work kind of takes a couple different forms. One is doing direct community support to people who are suffering the impacts of the extractive industries. So working to develop campaigns to elevate what communities need to keep themselves healthy and safe. We also do a lot of policy work to try and change the overall structure and the systems that regulate the extractive industries. So at Earthworks, I am the tailings campaign manager, which means I work on issues related to mine waste, industrial mining, and small scale mining also, but mostly industrial mining produces massive amounts of waste. Just to give a quick example, 1 ton to mine 1 ton of copper, you produce currently, mining companies are producing about 512 tons of waste. So the waste to metal ratio for copper is 512. Gold is worse. Gold is the worst of all. And gold is 1 gram of gold is about 100,000 tons of waste. So mining creates, a lot of mining engineers say that mining isn't really about extracting metals. It's about ways to figure out how to store waste. So my role at Earthworks is to work with communities that are living next to these waste piles, waste dumps, they're called tailings dams, and see how we can hold mining companies accountable so that they're not prioritizing their own profits over the safety of the people in the nearby community. I think it's also just important before to kind of get into your question to just say that also it's important to remember that mining, the industry, is the #1 toxic polluter in the United States, right? The mining industry pollutes more than any other industry in the country and probably in the world. 40% of the headwaters of rivers in the western part of the United States are polluted by mining, have been polluted by mining over time. And mining historically has been a tool of colonialism to take over lands, displace people, and extract profits from the earth. So I think that's a really important context to set up this conversation because, as most of you probably know, there are no active metallic mines in Maine right now. So thinking about the question, we have to look back in history a little bit where there were metallic mines. They have been all over the state, but most recently in the Brooksville, Blue Hill Peninsula area, where there were, which have now become Superfund sites because of the ways in which the mines were designed and because they were abandoned. And that's another kind of piece of the mining industry, is that the industry will come in, extract what they want, and then declare bankruptcy and leave. And so all of that waste that they've built, all of that destruction that they have caused falls on the local taxpayers, on the local government, or on all of us through the Superfund program, which is now cleaning up the Brooksville Blue Hill mine sites. So I think kind of having that context is important about the impacts that we've seen. And then in terms of the impacts around the proposed exploration, I mean, with folks here that have organized their communities to block mines in recent years, I don't know that I'm necessarily the best person to speak to this, but I think there's been a lot of things that we've seen as these mining companies have been coming into Maine. One is that they don't bring transparent information to communities. Communities don't know what the plans are, what the mine would look like, how the waste would be stored. They don't even know if the exploration is already happening. And that was one of the things that the amazing people in Pembroke figured out, was that the mining company was building roads, cutting down trees, doing exploration while they didn't even have any idea that was happening. So one of the big things that we see with the mining industry and that we've seen in Maine is that lack of transparency. And then the other thing, and then I'll stop talking and let my esteemed co-panelists here jump in, is that we also see an effort by the mining industry to promote themselves as the new, like a new industry, right? They say, no, we know we've polluted in the past. We know we've created problems. We know that this is historically, we've really been a toxic industry, but we fixed it and we figured it out and we've improved our technology and we know what to do now. And so we can build this mine, a modern mine. They love to always call them modern mines. We'll build a modern mine that won't pollute the water and that won't pollute the air and that won't have all these terrible noise disturbances for everybody that lives around the mine. And we saw that a lot in Maine too, where we have seen that. I shouldn't speak in the past because I bet there'll be a new company that comes within the next 6 months with a new proposal, right? But we've seen these proposals of these modern mines that claim to have everything figured out, when in reality, that is never the case. All mines pollute. And I like to point to a study that Earthworks did a number of years ago to kind of highlight that, where two hydrologists looked at a set of copper mines that were, again, modern mines, and read their environmental impact assessments, which are the documents that they have to present to the government to get a permit to be able to mine. In all of the environmental impact assessments, those companies said they would not pollute the water, the groundwater, off the mining site. They then looked at what happened after those mines began operating, and 78% of them were polluting the groundwater offsite, right? So every mining company is going to say they won't impact the water, they won't impact the land, they won't impact the air. But when you look at the data, they always do. So I think those are kind of some of the things that come to mind with that question.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Jan, for that entry point of the conversation. My name's Nikki Sakara. I live in Freiburg, Maine, and I'm a co-founder of Community Water Justice. We started back in 2012 on the heels of the world's largest food and beverage corporation, who owns the brand Poland Spring, when they were moving to secure a 45-year exclusive contract to bulk export water from our community. And so while we're talking about metallic mining here today, you know, my origin started in water mining. And I use the term water mining. That's a very controversial term to use because, you know, if we're extracting bulk water at such a rate that from deep within the ground that it is not replenishing itself in good time, there's going to be issues with that. And we've had some situations where our groundwater levels have been on a slight downward trajectory. And in our state, we have the fox watching the hen house type situation where these multinational corporations and now private equity firms are the ones collecting the data and informing our government on how their extraction is going. And how these are connected is, you know, on one hand, when we allow and invite mining companies into our community, there's always a solution or the default solution of bottled water when we contaminate our own drinking water. And so, you know, these types of industrial prospects feed off of each other in that regard. So, you know, when we hook communities on bottled water, always having to import our water sources, that's a tremendous amount of energy that's used. Moving water sources around the planet is not sustainable, no matter what, you know, Poland Spring or any other bottling company might promote themselves and through their marketing to being a sustainable and environmentally friendly business. It's just simply not. Never mind the amount of plastics that we're sentencing to our landfills. So there's this symbiotic relationship that we see between these industrial prospects. And we have to think about where Maine is positioned globally right now, because by 2025, they're projecting, a third of the world population will not have access to clean water. And so we need to think about what that means for places that are considered water rich, where we have a lot of resources, water resources, and the multinational corporations that are coming in to gain control over water sources, because that's not only happening here in Maine. There's other places in the world where rights to groundwater are being purchased through land ownership. That puts us in a particularly dangerous spot in Maine, where we have an antiquated absolute capture or absolute dominion law on the books. So just like a bottled water or water mining company, and also similar to a metallic mining company, if you own the land, then you own the rights to mine whatever water that you need from underneath your land. And so that was challenged in court back in 1999 because there was a situation, it was actually a gravel pit. So they were gravel mining and rock mining, and their outfit dewatered their neighbor's property. And so they wound up in court because one property owner was taking more than their fair share, and it was impacting his neighbor's ability to access water. And ultimately, the Maine State Supreme Court ruled on the side of the landowner that was taking too much water and impacting his neighbors, because the Maine State Supreme Court punted it back to the legislature and said, you haven't changed this law, so we're going to uphold it until you change it. And to date, there's been many attempts at the state level to change this legal doctrine that actually puts us at risk and makes all of us quite vulnerable to think that, these multinational interests with access to water, that at the end of the day, we don't have a mechanism to hold them accountable with our laws to make sure that they're not impacting their neighbors. So, so it does impact all of our communities: water mining, metallic mining, and that symbiotic nature of, if you destroy your water, we'll provide it to you in bottles. And so that's just, that sounds like a death spiral, environmentally and economically, because bottled water is much more expensive than maintaining our local, protecting our local water sources for our local populations. Not that we can't have some sort of sharing, for communities that are, experiencing acute situations, but this business model is really harmful. And so in the work that I do, I also, it's kind of expanded beyond, water privatizations and takings through bottled water industry or, multinational corporations coming in to purchase our municipal water systems as well. That's another growing issue. I was in Pembroke, and I'm also in, Union, Warren, and Hope area, supporting those communities because they have a nickel mine, or they want a nickel mine. Exira wants to go in there and take the metals under, in the earth there. And so it's the question that's posed to these communities, like how much do you value clean water? Because you can't have metallic mining and clean water. And so we're kind of forced into this choice right now and deciding like what's more important, because mining outfits, I mean, you might get 10, 20 years, to mine a deposit. And so those are temporary jobs, and that's temporary wealth. And a lot of it's, it goes up and out of the community. So yeah, I guess I'll stop there for right now.
Thank you, Nikki. I mean, I think both are tapping into why we're doing this. It's very easy to hear both from politicians and from mass media, from like the mining company's voice. You hear it when you look at, a nice 14-karat piece of jewelry. So this is, I guess, again, bringing to the surface some of those key issues that tap into the economy, tap into the history, tap into community health, tap into culture. So with that, Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, I'm Bruce Taylor. I'm a physician, and I initially got exposed to metals, and I have to say, inadvertently, I think throughout my career, one way or another, and I didn't really plan it, I've been involved with metals. But initially, as a medical student at William Beaumont Army Hospital in El Paso, they had the ASARCO, American Smelting and Refinery Corporation, smelter, which incidentally had the largest structure at the time, 814 feet between Houston and LA. And I was involved with the initial blood lead studies that were done. I was not on the American side with Dr. Philip Landrigan. I worked over on the Mexican side on blood levels, lead blood levels. And I was shocked at the high level. Back then, the danger level was 40 micrograms per liter of lead. Today it's 3.5, but even there, 60 to 70% of the kids that we drew blood on had elevated levels. And there's a correlation between, very crude correlation, because it was very difficult to get good statistics from schools here, just on the other side of Juarez. But it looked like there is a strong correlation between learning and blood lead levels. And again, I have also seen arsenic intoxication in a mining community in Suriname, which is old Dutch Guiana. And finally, when I lived in Corpus Christi, there was a bank, ASARCO, the refining company, the largest one in the United States, went bankrupt. But yet in Corpus Christi, Texas, they left an area called the Hillcrest right around it, just filled with heavy metals. And again, when we looked there at a study that showed things such as neurologic deficits, premature births, you could basically plot out from the industrial area, the closer you were, the higher incident of diseases like that. The only real experience I've had with mining in Maine is at one time I was with a friend and we tried to go shell fishing off of Gooseneck Bay, where the bankrupt Callahan Corporation mine is located. And since it was closed in 1972, it's been a Superfund site, which is one not completely remediated. And also all of you that are taxpayers in Maine should be glad to know that the state of Maine, through your taxes, pays 10% of that remediation. So just don't think the feds pick up the bill. We're paying every year that the EPA remediates. They send a bill to the state and they run it through supplemental appropriations on the Department of Transportation. So we are paying for remediation just for one mine. And what concerns me, the way things are set up, that we're going to be paying on legacy mines, which eventually all the new mines will be. We're going to be paying, somebody's going to be paying a whole lot of money financially. But what concerns me the most, and I'll be quiet in a second and probably address this later, is the problems that you see with health, especially with the neurologic development of the fetus and small child when they're exposed to heavy metals such as lead, mercury, cadmium, and also arsenic. That is a real problem. The CDC, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, CDC, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, and just about everybody but the mining companies say that there is no safe level for lead. You'll find administrative levels for multiple reasons, very low, 3.5 micrograms per deciliter, but there is no safe level for lead. And when you look at mining, whether it's just digging it out of the ground, whether you look at leaving the waste, which is contaminated, leach out into the water or into the dust, or if you're looking at refining, where they heat it up to really get to pure metal and they put all the dust up in the air, or a lot of the dust up in the air, other dust has to be buried somewhere, like in your local, they'll take it to a local dump and bury it. That causes a real long-term problem and generates legacy problems. And I will discuss it later perhaps, but I do not think, quote, the new mining law from the 127th Maine legislature that set the new mining law, it is, a lot of people say it's the strictest. From the medical point of view, although of the 44,273 words, they mentioned protect public or protect human health 47 times. It's like opening a medical book. And what's this book about? And in every page, the only thing it says is treat the patient, get them well, and it says nothing else. There is basically no protocol and nothing specified to protect human health. And I'm not a lawyer, but if you take that to court, they get free reign. And this is very, very concerning to me. I can talk about that later. Thank you.
Welcome, Nick.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry I'm late. I apologize to the panelists and to Stephanie and to all the drivers on 295 just now. I'm not sure what was covered earlier, but I'm Nick Lund. I work for Maine Audubon. We are an independent Audubon organization. We've been around since 1843. Started here in Portland as the Portland Society for Natural History. And so in that time, so we do everything. We basically we love Maine wildlife, and so we work to educate and protect and advocate on behalf of Maine wildlife in all the different ways that we can. And in that 100 and whatever years, we've seen a whole lot of things go on. We've seen a whole lot of the impacts that humans do to Maine and to the environment, and have luckily worked to reduce the amount of mining in Maine sort of before it starts. Maine is really lucky not to have some of the impacts of minerals mining, especially that a lot of other states have. I've spent significant time in Appalachia and in the West, and there's a lot more mines out there. And one of the good things that Maine has done is sort of caught that before it could get worse, really. Maine is, in terms of our environmental history, fairly progressive and forward-thinking, and we've been able to stop, look around the country and see other things that are happening and say, I don't want that to happen here. So in terms of minerals mining, we're lucky to have avoided, the worst case scenarios, which we know there are lots of worst cases if we let it get there. And we've seen those worst cases all over the country, and in the few places that there have been mines in Maine, they've been pretty bad cases. It's a constant fight, though. Maine Audubon was proud to play a role in a issue that resolved earlier this year with a proposed mineral mine at a place called Picket Mountain up near Katahdin Woods and Waters up in central Maine. We took these lessons that we know from around the country. This is going to be terrible for water quality. It's going to be terrible for human health. And we joined with lots of other folks locally and statewide to oppose that. And we were successful. So that the LUPC, Maine's Land Use Planning Commission, said no to the permit for Picket Mine, which is a great victory. But it's one that needs to be fought every single time. And that's something that we, are sort of resigned to with all environmental issues, but something that we're proud of in Maine, that we've built a strong capacity to fight against things that we know aren't going to work. And so I would say that's mining in Maine for me.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned kind of the power in numbers, and then a couple really workable models out there. And I would say Pembroke, and my watching the campaign again that was kind of initiated by Severin and Greenhorns was a success in pulling people together. That it wasn't just one person on the job or one louder voice. It was word spread through, church dinners, PTA meals, blueberry harvests and that sort of thing. It was just a beautiful model for word of mouth and community really forming. I mentioned to you that Chuck Loring unfortunately couldn't be here today, but what he mentioned on this is that, and these are his words, I would say that mining not only takes its toll on the environment if it's permitted to occur, but also takes its toll on the capacity of our Department of Natural Resources. We are barely adequately staffed to carry out day-to-day operations. And when we're faced with issues like these, a number of other duties aren't able to be carried out. It's an important thing to note. And so I'd like to note too that, most of the organizations, nonprofits that our panelists are involved with are not mega corporations, right? It's truly, following, embodying that community model. So with that, my second question is, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing the Maine environment today? Anyone like to jump in?
Well, I'll start just because I also want to echo something that Chuck mentioned about capacity. Our own Department of Environmental Protection not only do the Penobscots have limited resources to, staff adequately to face these challenges, our own state Department of Environmental Protection does not. I remember I was in a work session for one of the mining bills, and they had mentioned that they would have 2 staff people to kind of oversee the mines in the state. And that is not nearly enough to make sure that they're following regulations and harm isn't being done. We just don't have the staff to hold accountability. So that's another risk that we put ourselves at because, depending on the administration, I remember during the LePage administration, took some funding away. So, they're often working with, understaffed. And so that's an ongoing problem. I mean, and there are people within the DEP that truly do care. There's people that care deeply, but, the system as it exists, it makes it hard for them to do the job that they would need to do to hold accountability for these industries. So, but here, you can go and answer the question and then I'll come back.
Yeah, well, having seen firsthand
Pivot.
the harm, both in industrial situations and also in individual acute intoxications of heavy metals, but especially when you're talking about industrial situations like the mercury mine in Texas, the mines that I saw in Suriname, and then the refining of the metals, I'd be very concerned here in the state of Maine, which would come about. Very obviously, we use metals every day. Medicine is full of metals. And when I was in the military and armored and aviation units, we had lots of metals, very, very important in many ways. But I'm very concerned when you look at the most recent mining bill, may be good in other aspects, but when it comes to protection in human health, it doesn't exist. A very good example is in Pembroke, where they wanted to reactivate an old lead mine, go through it, and go down and get the gold and silver. That was 1 mile from the wind blows down to Pembroke Elementary School, and they were going to go through a mine that had lead. Another example is in Warren, where they wanted to put the nickel, one of the spots where they were considering putting the nickel, and they may be now. No, I think they have a ban for mining, fortunately. But they wanted to put the nickel lead mine within a half mile of residences and a little more than a mile from a school. If you look at the current mining regulations as they exist now, they have setbacks, mandated buffers, up to 1 mile for state bodies of water, state wildlife refuges, and parks. They say nothing. The setbacks for houses, like for a well, is like 300 feet. So the state is protecting their land, their property, but they don't protect the people. And there are many other problems with the mining law. They don't require baseline evaluation, periodic evaluation, such as with the EPA's human exposure model. So I really think that, and the history of the DEP going up against the big boys, not some guy who happens to own a car wash, but the big boys, like we've talked about the Callahan mine, but we don't have any more mines, but just look what happened in South Portland. Two of the petroleum storage companies violated their permit for a number of years. Under their nose, the EPA had to catch it. One of them didn't even have permit for some of the carcinogenic substances it was emitting, and it took the EPA to catch it. And then what happened, it was so bad that I think in the 130th legislature, LD 71, which was passed and pushed by the South Portland people, was passed by the legislature, they mandated that the DEP, talking about not having the resources to monitor or regulate, but not resources to monitor, they had to have the DEP. They mandated the DEP to measure the benzene levels in South Portland, because Kaler Elementary is just on the other fence side of the Portland tank farm. So if you kick a ball over the fence when you're playing kickball, it's going to land there. And and DEP said, we don't have the resources to measure carcinogenic benzene. So I think we have a real problem with monitoring and enforcement in this state. And now we have a mining law say, come on in. And let me tell you, Maine is not ready for the big time. And when they start playing with the extractive industries, they better make sure that they are protecting somebody's health. And in my opinion, they are nowhere near it. Look at the law and look at, like you say, 2 people for mining in the DEP. And I'll stop at that, but metals are toxic.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. I think that leads us as a great segue to that third question that maybe Jan and Nick can address. So where are we now? How can Maine serve as a model for other states? You mentioned some different towns. Just how can it serve as this model to protect the environment? Are you involved with other initiatives?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to answer that. Specifically in regards to mining or to other challenges, I mean, I think climate change has to be brought up too when we're talking about general, the question of the biggest environmental challenges facing Maine. I mean, climate change is the one that I spend most of my time on, and Maine Audubon does. You know, we as much as we would like to put Maine in a jar and have it be protected forever, it's changing already, and we have to act one way or another. There are a lot of challenges inherent in that. There are specific ones, like how do we respond to sea level rise against private property, and how do we get private property owners to somehow allow natural erosion to occur so we can maintain beaches and salt marshes. Also, how do we get to, and this is a much more controversial one, frankly, is how do we get to yes on the actions that we need to take to respond to climate change? And this is where Maine could be a model for the rest of the country. This is something that everyone around the country is struggling with. How do we cite renewable energy in a way that means that we can get off of foreign sources of oil, but still protect the environment as much as possible? How can we plan for growth as people are going to be moving from Maine to Maine from places that they can't live anymore? These are very difficult issues for folks to come together on, because everyone wants to fight climate change, but when it is the woods near your house becoming a dense housing development, or when it's wind turbines going up somewhere that you could see, it's much harder to get people to say yes to that specific impact. And so that challenge is one that is playing out in Maine and around the country right now. And it's one that we can be a leader on. And we are, I think, being a leader in a number of ways. You know, Maine Audubon does a lot of work with solar facilities, for example, to ensure that they're planting native plants underneath, or that there's dual use agriculture happening, or that, for example, towns just have maps and resources available to them so that they can see where to put renewable energy into areas that of least conflict or wildlife impact. And growth the same way, promoting smart growth principles that allow towns to grow to respond to the need that is coming to them, but do it in a way that makes for a good town and makes for a good environment. That's not a given, and this country is littered with examples right now of that not going well, of ugly fights about projects that somehow could have been avoided up front. And so when I think about how we can serve as a model, and also what the biggest challenges are facing our community in the next X number of years, it's getting ourselves around taking the actions that we need that are sort of a break from the environmental history that groups like us have been forever, which is just to say no to lots of things. And how do we get to saying yes in a smart way? That's going to be a big challenge, but I think one that we can lead and should lead.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I was just thinking, I think the thing that Maine has done really well, and if kind of coming back to the context of the fights where we have stopped new mines from being built in the state, I think the thing that Maine has been a leader on and has done really well is kind of this comparison that we are doing of assessing the impacts that a proposed industry would have on the environment, on health, on the local economy, against a speculative boom industry that's proposing a lot of change and that's trying to sell itself as the savior for a lot of problems. And so I think that model of communities understanding, analyzing, and making decisions for themselves and what's best for their local communities is really important. And just to kind of thinking about what you were saying, Nick, in terms of planning for growth, I think an opportunity that Maine has is to also think strategically in terms of climate change. How are we taking the steps necessary to move away from fossil fuels, to do everything that we can to stop the warming of the planet, but to also not just shift sacrifice zones onto other people and other places and other environments. And when we talk about climate change at Earthworks, we often talk a lot about the false narrative that is being presented right now that we can mine our way out of climate change, right? So we know that we need urgent action to address the problems of climate change. We know that electric vehicles are going to help us get there, and they're super important. But the solution to climate change is not everyone replacing your fossil fuel car with an electric vehicle, right? Electric vehicles are the main driver right now in demand projections for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper. And those, like I said, are four metals that produce a lot of waste, create a lot of problems, and we'll need new mines if we accelerate at the pace that we're going in the way that we have planned. And so when I think about Maine, one of the things that comes up for me is one solution to demand increasing hundreds of times over for metals is to reduce dependency on cars, right? And to reduce single-use vehicles or single families that have, those of us that have multiple vehicles per person in the family. How do we do that? A great way to do it is to build cities or to build towns in ways that you don't need a car. A great way to do it is invest in public transit. And, I live in Rockland, and whenever I go to a talk like this or do a panel like this, I often think about, could I get to that panel on public transportation? Or do I have to drive my car from Rockland to the place that I'm going? And to get to Portland from Rockland, no. I mean, if I wanted to take the bus at 8:30 in the morning this morning and then wander around all day, spend the night because it leaves at 3:30 in the afternoon and take the bus back tomorrow, I could. But there's no way to move around our state unless you own a vehicle, right? And so we need to think of ways to reduce our dependency on the technologies that we know are causing climate change. And that one way to do that is to think and plan for growth and think strategically.
Thank you, and thanks for making that very critical connection between this conversation and what is presenting itself right now as a current and forthcoming issue. I want to mention Chuck's notes on this in terms of, where do we go from here? What kind of work is he doing? Is his community doing? And what he mentions at the forefront is not individual projects, but that simple conservation of land is important. He says, the nation is involved in a couple of land return projects currently, one being for the 30,000 acre Wasatech project with the Trust for Public Lands, another being about a 2,000 acre project near Williamsburg with the Appalachian Mountain Club. These projects would both expand on existing tribal trust lands, but most importantly on existing conservation corridors that stretch across the state from the Katahdin region to Jackman. So seems to be a multifaceted, multi-layered approach to being able to move forward. What can our community, the people, our audience that's here today, what would you recommend as either opportunities to get involved or to get more information?
Go first. What opportunities exist to get involved for more information?
Well, that's sort of a hard question for me to answer. Certainly, I've been involved. Like I say, I have grave concerns about the protection of human health with mining. So one thing that I've been involved in is going to local communities and telling them the pros and the cons of mining, specifically to human health. Certainly, habitat loss of biodiversity, climate change are very devastating from a health point of view, but specifically narrowing in the mining, I think you have to be very careful. And that's one of the reasons why more not more and more, but multiple towns now have either enacted or are considering to enact banning on mining. And I think one of the reasons is I think the need for metals is great and mining can be done safely. But unfortunately, the 127th legislature passed the Mining Act, mildly amended in the 131st, really offers no human health protections. In fact, there is even an article in the Maine Morning Star about a discussion on a bill that was defeated, a health protection bill. And some of the things brought up, it would be too costly to have human health protections, was brought up in the E&R committee, and also was brought up that it'd take a lot of time to do that, to enact these. Well, that's sort of shocking because number one, if you want to look at the profit costly, the mining industry is one of the most profitable industries. CEOs are getting sky-high salaries, nothing wrong with making money, and investors are making a lot of money. In fact, even Gary Nagel, the CEO of the international behemoth company Glencore, said producers have come under pressure to cut their emissions. That would mean missing on the bumper profits that we're pumping out. So I think really, I think cost is not a major issue. You don't want to have unnecessary costs, but the protection of human health is very important. And then they said time. Well, even the mining industry agrees that if they cut what they think is maybe, but what they consider unnecessary bureaucracy to get their permit, it'll take still 2 or 3 years for a mine in Maine, a new mine, to get going. That gives them plenty of time. And I think the discussion was concluded on why they gutted the health mining bill was that I think their response was that it was a needed trade-off, that not putting human health protections was a needed trade-off to go ahead and get mining going, like I say. And what they said, well, it's too costly and take too much time. I think that's wrong. So I think people really have to be aware and get involved, locally. Don't get me wrong, habitat loss of biodiversity, climate change are devastating, but I'm focusing in on mining and metals. And the state of Maine has to do it beforehand. If you look at the Brunswick PFAS release, that was all post-fact. We need to be ahead of the curve, and we need to institute some good health protections for people. And that's a very narrow point that I'm taking, but I think it's very, very important from cost and also just the human suffering that I've seen from metals. Thank you.
Thank you. We're fortunate in Maine where we're a home rule state. Things happen from the ground up. They start right in your community. So just like what happened in Pembroke and what's going on in Union, Warren, and Hope. They wanted stronger protections than what the state offered currently to make sure that their water's going to be safe for their future generations. And so, I'd invite you all to start right in your community and, look at your municipal water system to make sure that you know where your water's coming from and that we have good, strong source protections. And it's a municipal system that's being protected and maintained by the public and for the public. And look at what your ordinance is. It's really interesting once you start to look into your community, what ordinances you have in place, your local regulations and laws, because you have the authority as a municipality to do better by the environment than the state laws have. So, you can put things in, like there's more monitoring. The company has to put up, more money and hire people for better monitoring. And so, we have, the global water wars are coming, and in Maine, it looks like a lot of large multinational corporations coming in that are water use heavy, like mining, like on-land fish farming to the scale that some are being proposed. There's some smaller, more localized outfits that are great, but there's a lot going on. So look and see how you're protecting your water locally. And a lot of these other environmental things will come into alignment. And so we have to think, because, we're not here denying climate change, it's happening. But we have to also look at systems change and how we can involve ourselves in this critical systems change to protect our environment. And so while we roll out this renewable energy transition at every step of the way, what can we do to center the protections of our intact ecosystems? Because the narrative is, we're using climate change, but we're also in the middle of a mass extinction. And I think that we would confront a lot of these ways differently if we were thinking about it as a massive extinction and needing to protect ourselves and the biodiversity of our region. So, a little bit of reframing into our communities as we're thinking about these things would be really important. So that way, whatever projects for renewable energy that we're rolling out, we're really centering and trying to uphold these intact ecosystems of what there is left.
I would, yes.
Oh.
I'll be very brief. As long as there are minerals and metals in the ground, mining companies are gonna wanna mine, right?
Right.
They're never gonna go away. And so I think one thing to do is to pay attention in Maine, pay attention to proposals to mine and to get involved and be active. I think the success that we've seen so far is because people have organized and people have come out and people have participated and they've learned, like y'all are doing today. And so watch out. There's gonna be more mining companies soon.
Yeah, I'll just say too, I mean, there are a million ways to get involved. Maine is an unusually organized state environmentally. There are lots of groups here all doing work together and on their own. And so it's really just find what you're interested in and then find the group. It may be up here, it may be someone else doing what you want to do and call. Maine Audubon has a million volunteer opportunities all across the spectrum. Everyone else is doing great work. And so find what you're passionate about and we can help you get what you want.
Thank you. Chuck mentioned too, donating to land return projects is always his first answer. But really being involved in NGOs and supporting them as well as tribes is also good. And just making your voice be heard, whether it's offering testimony at a public hearing, talking to political folks, or just talking to the people around you can make all the difference in the world. It certainly has for me, myself. I want to thank my panelists for a very thought-provoking conversation. I'd like to invite each one of you to head up to the USM Gorham campus to the art gallery to see the Undercurrent show, which runs through December 7th. And feel free to stay in touch through my own art practice at IG. It's at Garin Studio, or my website, which has links to all these wonderful organizations at www.garinstudio.com. I want to thank our panelists today, and then if we have a couple minutes, I know we have to stop our filming, but I'm happy. Could we stay for maybe three questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Questions? Yes.
So yes, there's a
Sure.
very big lithium deposit in the state of Maine. To my knowledge, it has not been studied to the extent that we can really say it's one of the biggest lithium deposits in the world, even though that is thrown around a lot. So one thing to know about that is that there isn't a lot of great information about what lithium mining in Maine would look like. The type of deposit that it is called a spodumene deposit. And there isn't currently any spodumene mining in the United States. There's a proposed spodumene mine in North Carolina. There's maybe one operating mine in Canada, and then the rest of the spodumene mining currently in the world is in Australia. So we don't have a lot of kind of baseline data around what this impacts of this mine will be, could be, to the extent, or the extent of what those impacts could be. However, there was a bill that passed last year in the legislature to change the Maine mining regulations to facilitate a larger open pit, a larger hole than is currently allowed under Maine regulation for metallic mining because of the argument that it's mining in sand instead of mining in hard rock, or because it's a spodumene deposit instead of a hard rock deposit. So unfortunately, it looks like that process is going to have less stringent oversight than other metallic mines would, which is obviously very concerning, especially given the fact that we don't really quite understand what the
Yeah.
impacts could be. I know others on here have followed.
Yeah, and I'll let you, I just want to say
Yeah.
one quick.
Go ahead.
I was, I forgot what I was gonna say now. Go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
well, I'll be quick. Actually, they amended, that was the last amendment, the only amendment to the Maine metallic mining law was just passed. And about lithium, it was said that it's quarrying like your granite tabletop. And the big point was that they made, which is a good point, it didn't produce acid mine drainage, which sulfuric mines that you find your zinc, gold, lead, copper, usually are associated with sulfur, which causes sulfuric acid mine drainage, which is devastating. However, they did exempt them from turbidity and sedimentation. And they're probably about 2 miles where this mine is in Newry, on Mount Plumbago. It's about 2 miles from the Androscoggin River. And if you remember with, I guess it was Senator Mitchell back in the 70s, who used that area of the Androscoggin to start the Clean Water Act. So I'd be very concerned about this. And there is actually an article, and if I can get your name, I can send it to you, that was in a mining journal that said it had the highest concentration of lithium in spodumene of anywhere else. I don't think it was the largest. And I think the mine she was talking about was the Thacker Pass mine in Nevada, which has just been approved, I believe, by the federal government on Native American land. And in their environmental impact statement, although it's different, they're mining lithium or spodumene from clay and not hard rock, but they are using, to give you an example, 1.6 billion, in their environmental impact statement submitted to the federal government, 1.6 billion gallons a year of water, or 3,222, something like gallons per minute of water they're using. And they're trucking in hot molten sulfur so they can make sulfuric acid to extract the lithium. Now, again, I would say, we don't think that's going to happen here, but the thing I would say to everybody as you think about, I would contend that the Maine Mineral Metallic Mining Act is a very permissive act. You have to look at it very carefully. They say it's strictest, in some ways it is, but you better be careful, look very carefully in what is permissive and what is in an act. And again, the problems with generating sulfuric acid, the particulate matter, the sulfur dioxide being generated on that is very concerning as a physician. And I'll shut up.
Yeah.
I
And
think we have time for maybe, if it's okay to segue to
Yeah.
1 or 2 more questions.
yeah, totally.
I think that's why we're here.
Mm.
And this is where the position gets almost apolitical, right? It's how are we using our resources, all of our resources, financial, intellectual, scientific, cultural, how does it pull together? And I think the question about lithium, and Jackie and I were chatting about this earlier, is a perfect example. Because while the government might be claiming it's one thing, scientists are saying we're just starting to kind of figure this out. Politicians are being pulled in different directions, certainly with different influences, right? And so that's where, and as an artist, the way you stand ground is by just you getting educated, you figuring out how you can get involved and how you can decipher your own truths.
Yeah, and I want to get to yes, but it doesn't mean I have to say yes to everything. Some things we can just say no to. If, this type of mining, we can't do it safely, and we're not going to do it. We're not going to support doing it, like we did with the Wolfton Mine and Pickett. And so there's that. So I want to get to yes, but we're not doing it at the expense of the things we hold dear. But it does mean if there's progress towards a way to do it safely or something, then we're open to hearing what can happen.
Why don't we wrap up with Ms. Miller? Is there?
It's in the Metallic Mining Act. And actually what I was quoting, although the rule, chapter 200 rules from the DEP was more specific than that. As many people know, the legislative process, they write the law, then the DEP and the lobbyists get to sort of interpret the rules or make the rules. And so the setbacks that I'm referring to of a mile up to a mile, it varies, is in the chapter 200 metallic mining rules. And yeah, if you look at the testimony, and I forget what bill it was, 1853, maybe back in the 127th, which is Metallic Mining Act. I can't remember the number. You can see the testimony, and there was some medical testimony put in. Although I think then again, the emphasis was, and you can't really knock it, that there is a crisis with climate change. And also, I think very important, the other thing is they were looking at, oh boy, we can get mining, which is good for jobs and everything else. Now, the other side that hasn't been talked about is a mining excise tax right now. The reason why miners like to come to Maine is, and you can look at it, 0.9%, less than 1% the mining excise tax from the gross proceeds. If you look at other states, somewhere between 3 to 5 to 7%. There was a bill that was not signed by the governor, passed bipartisan by both parties through the House and the Senate. She did not sign that said we're going to increase it to 5%. And we're going to take some of that money to give it back to the impacted communities. Because if you're not on a state road, if your road isn't a state road, it's a town road, and a 50 million ton truck comes and starts tearing it up, you're not going to get any state money. If they have problems with water filtration, like get the PFASs out, get all the metals out that they don't get in the mining process, which is why one of the reasons why even that Wolfton got their the state-of-the-art permit before the LUPC for the mine at Pickett Mountain got thrown out. They didn't have proper water treatment. And that's going to fall back on the communities. But yet that bill was not signed by our governor for reasons which I don't know, because you don't sign a bill as opposed to a veto. You don't have to say anything. You just don't sign it. And that's very concerning because what they're doing, we're already paying for the Callahan mine, and I don't think a small community like I live in rinky-dink Sweden should have to pay for all the mess that the miners leave behind. And the financial assurance, which is in the mining bill, like put the money and so when you leave, like Callahan will have money. It's hard to get a bond now for a mine, so I don't know where they're going to put the financial insurance and assurance, and if they're even going to do anything adequate. Because if you look at West Virginia, it's never been adequate, and all they do is sell the mines to some paper company, and then they declare bankruptcy and they get rid of it. So we have to be very careful. I'm all for mining, and I use mine metals in the military and medicine and in my personal life. And I practice around a place where I saw kids die from petrochemicals, but we have to be very careful. We have the chance here now to do it right before we start mining and protect health. And I don't think it's coming down the pike.
Well, and also the fact that it's cheaper to mine fresh minerals than it is to recycle them is a problem because the company's not on the hook for the ongoing remediation ad infinitum. We need to flip that. Because renewable energy, can we call it that if we're continually extracting resources in not a regenerative way? And so there you have it. It is, the end game is gonna be similar.
The end game, and I would say the starting game, I know could do maybe next year, the USM, mining or use this as a base for like a 3-day conference. Unfortunately, we do need to wrap up. I, again, would like to invite you all. There's a very generous reception right outside. Please help yourself to some refreshments. And if I could just thank all my all the panelists here again, for your time, for your passion, for your work. Thank you.
Yep.